Welcome to Sanctified Secret. In the humid lowlands of Burke County, Georgia, 1852, Master Elijah Thornwood stood on the veranda of Ironwood Plantation and surveyed what he considered his greatest accomplishment. It was not the 2,000 acres of prime cottonland, not the 300 enslaved people who worked his fields, not even the Greek Revival mansion that rivaled any in the state. His pride lay in something far more disturbing. A calculated breeding experiment involving his 3 unmarried daughters and an enslaved man named Solomon. An arrangement that would create a hidden dynasty of mixed-race descendants whose existence would challenge the very foundations of Southern society. Elijah Thornwood was 58 years old in 1852. A widower who had lost his wife Martha to fever 5 years earlier. She had left him with 3 daughters and no sons, a situation that obsessed Elijah with increasing desperation as he aged. In the rigid patriarchy of the antebellum South, daughters could not inherit and manage plantations in their own names. Upon Elijah's death, Ironwood would pass to his brother's sons, and his daughters would become dependent on the charity of male relatives. This prospect tormented Elijah. He had built Ironwood from inherited debt into one of Georgia's most profitable operations. He had bred prize cotton, bred champion horses, bred slaves with specific traits that made them more valuable. But he had failed to breed sons who could carry his name and preserve his legacy. His daughters, beautiful and intelligent as they were, represented the end of his direct line. The 3 Thornwood daughters were studies in contrasts, despite their shared parentage. Margaret, the eldest at 26, was tall and severe. With her father's sharp intelligence and no patience for the performative helplessness expected of Southern ladies, she had refused 3 marriage proposals, finding the available men intellectually inferior and financially motivated. Caroline, 23, was softer in temperament, but equally stubborn about maintaining independence. She spent her days managing Ironwood's accounts with mathematical precision that surpassed most men. The youngest, Rebecca, had just turned 19 and possessed a passionate nature that her sisters tried, constantly, to temper. All 3 remained unmarried, not for lack of suitors, but by choice. They had witnessed their mother's gradual erasure through marriage and childbearing, had seen how women's identities dissolved into their husbands' names and properties. They had quietly agreed among themselves that spinsterhood, however socially unacceptable, offered more freedom than wifehood. But Elijah saw their unmarried state differently. He saw 3 healthy women of prime childbearing age, vessels that could carry his genetic legacy forward, even if convention prevented them from carrying his name. And he saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems with one audacious, horrifying solution. Solomon had been born on Ironwood Plantation in 1827, the son of field slaves whose own physical excellence had caught Elijah's attention years earlier. From childhood, Solomon had displayed unusual size and strength. By his 20th birthday, he stood 6'4" in tall, with a physique that made him the most physically imposing person on the plantation. But Solomon's value extended beyond physical power. He possessed intelligence that Elijah had deliberately cultivated, teaching Solomon to read, write, and manage complex agricultural operations. Elijah had invested heavily in Solomon's development because he saw him as breeding stock of exceptional quality. In the twisted economics of slavery, enslaved people were livestock to be bred for desirable traits. Elijah had been conducting selective breeding programs among his enslaved population for years, matching men and women he believed would produce the strongest, most intelligent, most valuable offspring. Now, looking at his unmarried daughters and his prized specimen, Solomon, Elijah conceived a plan, and so transgressive it would have destroyed him socially, if revealed. But he was a man accustomed to absolute power within his plantation's boundaries, and he convinced himself that his genetic legacy mattered more than social convention. The conversation Elijah had with his daughters in the spring of 1852 would be remembered by all three women as the moment their father revealed himself as something monstrous. He gathered them in his study, closed the doors, and presented his proposal with the same clinical detachment he used when discussing crop rotations or horse breeding. "You are all three in your prime childbearing years," he began without preamble. "You have all refused marriage, despite numerous suitable offers. I understand your reasons and do not challenge your choices. However, your refusal to marry does not eliminate my need for heirs to carry forward my bloodline." Margaret, always the boldest, interrupted immediately. "Father, we've discussed this. You have nephews who will inherit my brother's sons." Elijah cut her off. "Not my blood through my daughters. Not the children I should have had through you three, if you had done your duty to this family." The silence that followed was suffocating. The daughters exchanged glances, sensing something terrible approaching. "I have given this considerable thought." Elijah continued, "There is a solution that preserves your unmarried state while providing me with grandchildren who carry my bloodline. Solomon, our most physically and mentally superior slave, will father children with each of you." The shock rendered them initially speechless. When Caroline found her voice, it trembled with disbelief and fury. "You cannot be serious. You're proposing we bear children with an enslaved man. The scandal would destroy us." "There will be no scandal," Elijah said calmly. "You will each take extended trips to our coastal property, citing health reasons. You will give birth there, attended only by trusted slaves. The children will be raised here at Ironwood as part of the slave population. No one beyond this plantation need ever know their true parentage. And what possible reason could you have for creating mulatto grandchildren?" Margaret demanded. "They can never inherit. They can never carry your name. What purpose does this serve?" Elijah's answer revealed the full depth of his twisted reasoning. "They will carry my blood, which is what matters. They will be superior specimens, combining the intelligence and refined features of my daughters with Solomon's physical excellence and demonstrated mental capacity. I will train them, educate them secretly, prepare them to manage this plantation from the shadows. They will be property I control absolutely, unlike sons-in-law who might challenge my authority. This is my dynasty, built on my terms." A Rebecca, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're insane. You're asking us to participate in your breeding experiment as if we're livestock." "I'm offering you a compromise," Elijah countered. "You want independence. You'll have it. No husbands to obey. No marriages to dissolve your identities. You want to remain at Ironwood managing affairs as you've been doing. You may continue. All I ask is that you provide me with grandchildren who carry my blood forward." "And if we refuse?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then I will arrange marriages for all three of you immediately. You're still of marriageable age, and I have authority as your father to contract marriages without your consent. You can bear children with Solomon and maintain your independence, or you can bear children with husbands who will own you completely. Choose." The ultimatum hung in the air like poison. He promised that cooperation would secure their positions, managing Ironwood's operations indefinitely. He appealed to their intelligence, framing his plan as a scientific experiment in human breeding that could prove fascinating to minds as sharp as theirs. But most effectively, he isolated them from any outside perspective or assistance. Ironwood Plantation operated as its own world, with Elijah as absolute monarch. The daughters had no mother to appeal to, no male relatives who would challenge Elijah's authority, no legal standing to refuse his demands. In the suffocating social structure of 1852, Georgia, unmarried women were wholly under their father's control until death or marriage released them. Solomon learned of his role in Elijah's scheme through a direct order that left him no room to refuse. Elijah summoned him to the plantation office and explained the situation with the same clinical detachment he had used with his daughters. "You will father children with each of my daughters." Elijah stated, "You will be provided private quarters where these encounters will occur. You will discuss this with no one. You will treat my daughters with appropriate respect during these appointments. In return, your position on this plantation will be secured. Your family will receive certain privileges, and your children, once born, will be trained for positions of responsibility among my slaves." Solomon, who had learned early in life that enslaved people who argued with their masters faced brutal consequences, simply nodded. But his internal experience was far more complex. He understood he was being used as breeding stock, his humanity reduced to genetic material that would serve his master's twisted dynasty. He understood that any children born from this arrangement would be enslaved by their own grandfather, forever trapped in the system that had created them. But he also understood that refusal meant death, or sail south to the killing fields of deep South cotton plantations. His mother and siblings lived at Ironwood. His position as Elijah's most valued slave provided his family with protections and privileges they would lose if he resisted. He was trapped as completely as the Thornwood daughters, though his powerlessness operated through different mechanisms. The arrangement began in summer 1852. Elijah had a separate cabin constructed behind the main house, isolated from other slave quarters and accessible through a private entrance. Margaret was ordered to this cabin first, chosen because, as the eldest, she would be expected to lead her sisters into compliance. What happened in that cabin over the following months was experienced differently by the two people involved. For Margaret, it was systematic violation dressed up as duty, endured with the same grim determination she brought to managing plantation accounts. For Solomon, it was forced participation in the rape of a woman who had no more real choice than he did, complicated by the fact that refusing would mean his own destruction. Neither spoke during their encounters. Neither acknowledged each other when they passed in the plantation's daily operations. Both endured because endurance was the only option their positions allowed. Within 2 months, Margaret was pregnant. Caroline was sent to the cabin next, experiencing the same grim ritual. 3 months later, she too conceived. Rebecca, the youngest, fought her father's orders longer than her sisters had, but ultimately she too was sent to the cabin where Solomon waited. By spring 1853, all 3 Thornwood daughters were carrying Solomon's children. Elijah arranged extended stays at his coastal property for his daughters, sending them away in stages as their pregnancies became visible. He told neighboring planters that his daughters needed sea air for their delicate constitutions, a cover story that raised no suspicions in a society where wealthy women frequently retreated for health reasons. At the coastal property attended only by enslaved midwives, sworn to secrecy through threats and bribes, Margaret delivered a son in the winter of 1853. She named him Thomas, though he would never use the Thornwood surname. Caroline bore a daughter that spring, calling her Sarah. Rebecca gave birth to twin boys that summer, naming them Daniel and Isaac. The 4 children were brought back to Ironwood as infants and absorbed into the slave population, officially recorded as orphans whose mothers had died in childbirth elsewhere. No legal documents acknowledge their true parentage. In the eyes of the law, they were simply slaves born on Thornwood property, owned absolutely by Elijah Thornwood. But Elijah's treatment of these children revealed his true perception of them. They were housed in better quarters than other slave children, fed better food, clothed in finer garments. From their earliest years, Elijah supervised their education personally, teaching them to read, write, and calculate with the same intensity he had once devoted to Solomon's training. The plantation's enslaved community understood immediately who these children were. Physical resemblances to both the Thornwood daughters and Solomon were unmistakable. The special treatment they received confirmed suspicions, but no one spoke this knowledge aloud. She understood that someday this information might be needed, either to protect her children or to hold her father accountable if circumstances ever changed. Solomon watched his children grow, unable to acknowledge them as his own, unable to protect them from the institution that owned them. He had fathered 4 children he could never claim. With 3 women who had been forced into his bed as surely as he had been forced into theirs, the psychological burden of this impossible situation aged him rapidly. By 1855, Elijah declared his experiment a success and proposed its continuation. The 4 children were thriving, showing the intellectual and physical characteristics he had hoped to create. Elijah threatened forced marriages again, but his daughters countered that they would reveal his breeding program to their potential husbands, ensuring no respectable man would ally with the Thornwood family. Eventually, Elijah capitulated. The breeding arrangement ended, though his obsession with his hidden grandchildren only intensified. He poured his energy into their education and training, molding them into the managers he believed would perpetuate his vision for Ironwood. Long after his death, the 4 mixed-race children grew into exceptional young people, their unusual upbringing creating capabilities that transcended typical slave experiences. Thomas, Margaret's son, displayed his mother's strategic intelligence and his father's physical presence. Sarah, Carolyn's daughter, possessed mathematical genius that surpassed even her mother's abilities. The twins, Daniel and Isaac, Rebecca's sons, developed complementary skills in agriculture and mechanics that made them invaluable to plantation operations, but they also grew into the full understanding of their impossible position. They were Elijah Thornwood's blood grandchildren, carrying his genes and his training, yet they were his legal property, ownable and sellable like livestock. They were the daughter's children, yet could never be acknowledged as such. They were Solomon's offspring, yet could never claim that relationship openly. The Civil War reached Georgia in 1864, bringing with it the possibility of emancipation that seemed impossible just years earlier. Elijah, now 70 years old and failing in health, watched his world crumbling. The Confederacy was losing, and with it the entire social order that had enabled his twisted dynasty. In a final act that revealed the depth of his delusion, Elijah drafted a secret will, acknowledging his 4 mixed-race grandchildren and leaving them substantial property. A document that was legally meaningless because enslaved people could not inherit property, and because acknowledging his children's parentage would delegitimize his entire estate. Elijah died in January 1865, weeks before Sherman's forces reached Burke County. The Thornwood daughters, now in their late 30s and early 40s, faced the collapse of the plantation economy and their father's debt-ridden estate. But they also faced the possibility of finally acknowledging their children, as the Confederate collapse invalidated the laws that had made such acknowledgement impossible. When Union troops arrived at Ironwood Plantation in March 1865, proclaiming emancipation for all enslaved people, Thomas, Sarah, Daniel, and Isaac stood at a crossroads. They were 21, 20, and 18 years old, freed from slavery, but bearing the burden of impossible parentage. Their mothers, the Thornwood daughters, made a decision that scandalized what remained of Georgia society. Margaret, Caroline, and Rebecca publicly acknowledged their mixed-race children, claiming them as family, despite social consequences. The admission destroyed what remained of the Thornwood family's reputation, but it freed the daughters from decades of secrecy and shame. Solomon, now 38 years old, also claimed his children for the first time. The acknowledgement was bittersweet, coming only after emancipation made such claims possible. Years after the children needed his protection most, the 4 children, now legally adults and freed people, faced decisions about their futures. They carried Thornwood blood and Thornwood education, but they also carried the racial designation that barred them from most opportunities in the South. Some chose to stay in Georgia. Others moved north, seeking places where their mixed heritage might be less visible. Thomas remained at what had been Ironwood Plantation, purchasing land during Reconstruction and establishing himself as a farmer. He married a freed woman and had children who grew up knowing their complex heritage, carrying forward both Thornwood and Solomon bloodlines. Sarah moved to Philadelphia, where her mathematical abilities earned her work as a bookkeeper, despite racial prejudice. She never married, devoting herself instead to educational work in freed communities. Daniel and Isaac, the twins, established a mechanics business in Atlanta during Reconstruction, using skills learned at Ironwood to build a successful enterprise that employed both black and white workers. The Thornwood daughters themselves lived out their lives at Ironwood, managing what remained of the property through Reconstruction and into the 1880s. They never married, maintaining the independence they had fought for, though the cost of that independence had been participation in their father's breeding program. Margaret lived until 1893, maintaining encrypted journals throughout her life that documented the full story of Ironwood's hidden dynasty. She instructed her children to seal these journals for 50 years after her death, believing that time would be needed before society could handle the truth. When the journals were opened in 1943, they provided extraordinary documentation of selective breeding practices in slavery, of women's powerlessness even within wealthy white families, and of the genetic legacy that Southern white families were trying desperately to deny. The journals named names, provided dates, described circumstances with precision that made denial impossible. DNA analysis conducted in the 2000s confirmed the journal's claims. Thornwood descendants, both those who had always known their mixed heritage and those who had maintained fiction of pure white ancestry, shared genetic markers that proved common ancestry through Elijah Thornwood's breeding program. The revelation created crisis in some families who had built identities on racial purity narratives. It provided validation for others who had preserved oral histories about their connection to the Thornwood plantation. It demonstrated scientifically what many had always known anecdotally, that the South's racial boundaries had been violated constantly by the very people most invested in maintaining them. Modern historians studying the Ironwood case struggle with its ethical complexity. Elijah Thornwood was clearly a perpetrator who used his absolute power to force both his daughters and Solomon into a breeding arrangement none chose freely. But the daughters, despite being victims of their father's coercion, also participated in a system that treated Solomon and their children as property rather than family. Solomon emerges as perhaps the clearest victim, stripped of all agency, used as breeding stock, and denied the ability to claim or protect his own children until emancipation made such claims possible. Yet, even his victimization is complicated by his position as Elijah's trusted manager, a role that gave him power over other enslaved people, while leaving him powerless against Aaliyah's designs for him. The 4 children born from this arrangement inhabited an impossible position, carrying the bloodline of both slaveholders and enslaved, educated and capable, yet legally property until emancipation. Their lives demonstrate how slavery's racial categories could not contain the genetic reality of constant boundary crossing. Today, the site of Ironwood Plantation is partially preserved as historical property. The main house still stands, though in disrepair. The cabin, where the breeding arrangement occurred, was deliberately burned in the 1870s by Rebecca Thornwood, who told her children she could not bear to see it standing as testament to her father's crimes. In 2015, descendants of the Ironwood dynasty, representing both the Thornwood daughters and Solomon, held a reunion at the plantation site. Over 200 people attended, connected by blood through Elijah Thornwood's breeding program, creating a family tree that would have horrified the man who initiated it. The reunion included academic presentations about the genetics of the Thornwood-Solomon bloodline, testimonies from descendants about how family secrets had shaped their identities, and discussions about how to memorialize a history that involved both violation and survival. A plaque was installed acknowledging what had occurred at Ironwood. Hair. Master Elijah Thornwood forced his 3 daughters to bear children with an enslaved man named Solomon, creating a hidden dynasty that reveals both the absolute power of slavery and the genetic reality it tried to deny. We honor Solomon and his children, the Thornwood daughters, and all whose lives were shaped by circumstances they did not choose. The story of Ironwood Plantation challenges comfortable narratives about slavery, family, and Southern honor. It demonstrates that exploitation operated in multiple directions, that white women could be both victims and complicit participants in oppression, that bloodlines crossed racial boundaries constantly regardless of laws designed to prevent such crossing. It also reveals the psychological complexity of survival within impossible systems. Margaret, Caroline, and Rebecca made terrible choices, but within constraints that offered no good options. Solomon endured violations while simultaneously holding relative power over other enslaved people. The children navigated identities that society had no category for, neither fully white nor comfortably part of enslaved communities. What remains certain is that Elijah Thornwood's attempt to create a dynasty through forced breeding did produce descendants, hundreds of them now, spread across the United States, connected by DNA and by history. But his dream of controlling that dynasty from beyond death failed absolutely. The descendants defined their heritage on their own terms, acknowledging complexity rather than accepting shame, claiming all parts of their ancestry rather than denying inconvenient truths. The journals Margaret Thornwood kept, now archived at the Georgia Historical Society, end with an entry written shortly before her death. My father sought to create a dynasty he could control absolutely. Instead, he created freedom he could never have imagined. Children and grandchildren who carry his blood but reject his values, who know their complex heritage and claim all of it with pride rather than shame. This was not his intention, but it is his legacy. May all who read this understand that no system of absolute power, no matter how carefully constructed, can ultimately contain the human capacity for survival, adaptation, and the claiming of identity on one's own terms. Music.